creativity can be expressed through art, naturally, or through business, through relationships, through our interests.
Creativity means to me thinking outside of the way we normally see through our two eyes.
Creativity is expression.
A devotion to a craft and to continually test yourself and progress at it.
Creativity means the expression of an idea.
I think this world and relationships are built on the ability for people to share those passions and creativity with each other.
Thank you for tuning in to KLLR Creatives.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on KLLR Creatives. Today we're sitting down with Paul Golangco, a Dallas-Fort Worth-based photographer and videographer, and we're going to discuss storytelling, adaptability, and the future of photography. Enjoy. Paul, thank you for being here with us today.
It's great to be here.
Obviously, we are a coffee company, so let's start there. A lot of entrepreneurs and creative types use coffee to kind of fuel their creativity or fuel their work. Is coffee a part of your life?
Oh, absolutely.
What led you to get interested in coffee? Do you have a favorite coffee beverage?
Sure. Favorite coffee beverages are going to be the flat white cappuccino. Just kind of depends on the place. It wasn't until I came here to Communion where I started getting fed like oat milk lattes and vanilla lattes and mochas, and then the baristas here have gotten me addicted to some of those sweeter drinks. But anywhere else, I'm getting a cappuccino most likely.
Is there a component of the sweeter drinks like executed at a higher level that drew you to them in a way that hadn't previously at some more mainstream venues, or were you just not exposed to them previously?
Yeah, no, I think at other places it was just too sweet. And so here it's just a perfect balance of that sweetness, but also paired well with the coffee.
You're drinking tea right now.
I am. It just turned cold, and I didn't need a caffeine rush, so I'm sipping on some fall flavors.
Awesome. What does creativity mean to you?
Creativity means to me thinking outside of the way we normally see through our two eyes. So is there a perspective? Is there a way? Is there a story? Is there something that is from a different perspective?
All right. So to start, can you give our listeners a little bit of your personal biography?
Sure. Grew up here in Texas. I was born in El Paso, grew up in Arlington, went to A&M, and studied management of information systems. And it wasn't until my senior year of college where a friend of mine asked me to help her with her marketing project for this organization she was with. And I looked at her and I said, sure, but why me? And she looked at me and goes, oh, it's because you're really creative. And that was literally the first time I ever saw myself as anything but a computer nerd.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I was doing that. And through college, I worked at a company called Party Pics, which went to all the fraternity sorority parties and took pictures. I still get
probably
known.
Have some interesting stories from that.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I still actually get noticed as Party Pics Paul.
Oh, really?
Yes. Which is hilarious for a number of reasons.
Any crazy story from that come to mind?
I mean, one of them, I remember there was one particular frat there was a guy that was, every time I would show up, he'd go, dude, get a picture of me throwing up. And he would get hammered. And he's like, what's this? And this would just puke. I was like, you got it, man. He was living his best life. But yeah, so that's when I started picking up a camera, and then was doing that kind of on the side. I worked for a software company right out of college and quit my job looking to move overseas to find out what life was like working grassroots in the NGO sector. And then the month before I was supposed to leave, everything kind of fell apart with my plans. I had quit my job and didn't re-sign my lease to my apartment. So I was kind of jobless and homeless for about 4 months. And that was right the month before the economy collapsed. It was
perfect timing.
Yeah. And so the economy collapsed. And I was just like, well, I'm not going to get a corporate job now. So what do I know how to do? And it was photography. And so I started doing that and worked weddings and portraiture like a lot of people start off doing for 2 years. And in Dallas, that's like the moneymaker. You can make easily 6 figures doing that. And I was going broke. Part of that was just my inexperience in my youth. And then part of it was just I just didn't love it. And then I started moving more into humanitarian photography, and when I started doing that, things just really started clicking. People saw the passion behind what I was doing and picking me up for various jobs. And then more recently, I've moved more into the commercial sector and doing architecture, interiors, and image libraries, custom image libraries.
Has your passion been able to make that transition with you, going into the more commercial arena?
Yeah, that's honestly it was difficult at first because it was a pretty hard pivot. I traveled, it was probably 30 countries before I was the age of 30.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so I was every quarter I was going somewhere. And now it's been several years since I traveled internationally for photography. And there's definitely the itch to go travel, but I think the idea of telling stories is still kind of the thread that ties it all together. Telling the story of a commercial real estate property, and why is that valuable to an investor or to a buyer or to a leaser, or telling the story of a company's ethos through a custom image library. Those kinds of things, that thread of telling story is still there, and so I still get to engage in some of that.
Interesting. What about the initial transition from, software into a more creative endeavor? Aside from what you just mentioned about, you're needing to find your niche for your passion. Was it hard to kind of readjust your way of thinking for that?
I was only in software for 2 years, and working at that company, there's two sides of my brain. Well, most everybody's brain, but there's the really creative side, which is honestly the muscle that I'm still learning to have to exercise and to develop. But then there's the really structured side. So the structured side still stays with me, and it's something that I still am it's very easy for me to move into that. I love Excel spreadsheets. I was working with a friend of mine for a little bit on a production company, and I would throw together these spreadsheets for client proposals, and he was just always amazed at how I could just change a couple numbers and everything else in the spreadsheet changed. And so that part was easy, and it honestly benefited me to be able to bring that along with me.
Yeah, you think it helps you? I know some creative people that struggle with the business operation side of things. You think that was an advantage for you?
Oh, absolutely. It's something that I'm still super passionate about now, in helping other creatives and other entrepreneurs recognize that if you don't have a viable business, you're not going to make it as a creative.
Yeah. You do video as well. How did that evolve from initially photography?
Yeah, that was on a friend of mine had started a nonprofit in Zambia, and she had a photographer coming on the trip that was donating his time, and so she asked me if I could do video, and I had a camera that could do both, and so I said sure, and I figured it out from there. And the idea of storytelling, it's a natural move, and now a lot of people who are doing photography are also having to do videography as well, just because the demand's there.
Yeah. So it sounds like you kind of in ways kind of fell into the photography and videography kind of thing. Did you have any sort of formal training? I mean, looking at your work, I think you're very good at what you do.
Thank you.
How did you progress within your craft?
Yeah, I think it was a lot to do with the community I was involved in. There was a group of us who were all starting off in wedding photography at the same time, and we were all just kind of figuring out life as we went, and all of us were growing, and we would come together a lot. We were all friends, and it's fun now to see where everybody is in their careers, but having that community really helped to sharpen my eye and knowledge of the skill set that's needed.
Is your experience with a group like you've just talked about unique, or is that something typical? Like something I really like about working in the coffee industry is that for the most part, it's not incredibly proprietary. And a lot of times people are excited to share their knowledge and their experience and help other people grow. Is that similar in your industry?
It can be. When probably back in 2011, 2012, there was a co-working space. It was one of the first ones in Dallas that opened up, called Weld Spaces, and it was run by a guy named Austin Mann. He's a friend of mine, and he called around a bunch of other photographers in the area and said, hey, what would you think if we just built a space where all of us could work out of it together? And all of us had been dreaming of that in one form or fashion for a few years, and finally it happened. And so it was a space where creatives of all sorts could come and collaborate and talk ideas with each other. And it was fantastic because we worked with each other. It was collaboration, not competition. But there were lots of people who said, no, I'm not going to come over there and let all these other greedy photographers steal my clients.
Yeah.
And that's still a mentality here. And so you'll see kind of the whole range of like, no, my secrets are my secrets. And then you'll see a bunch of people who are saying, no, I'll share everything I know. And you see, I think YouTube has really helped with a lot of that as far as monetizing what you share. And so there's actually financial incentive to being more open.
Sure. So sometimes I'll see a photographer and, they've got just half a dozen cameras and a dozen lenses and, what's the balance between equipment and craft here?
Yeah, I actually almost sold some gear to a guy who's like, oh yeah, I just needed it as my third camera. I was like, you have 3 cameras? Like, what are you doing? And honestly, I don't know what he was doing to necessitate that. I think there's a real easy temptation in photography to be gearheads, to like want all the latest stuff and all the cool stuff. And I think if you're making enough that necessitates that, then great. But I say, like, if you're able to get the job done, there are better uses for your money. And so will that piece of equipment, that piece of gear further my career, further my business? Will it make me money? Or is it going to make my life significantly easier? That's the harder question that I have to ask myself now. There's a lot of stuff I want, but there's a lot of stuff you can rent or you can borrow. They're really easy nowadays with a lot of the online shops. And so it's a matter of what is the cost benefit.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I've thought before when kind of considering this, and, I know nothing about photography, really. But, I've seen pictures from 30 years ago, 50 years ago that were incredible pictures.
Yeah.
And they didn't have half of what we've got today.
Yeah. A friend of mine, he's got his master's in fine arts. I think it was fine arts, but he's got a master's in photography. And the one thing that I wish I had that I didn't get from learning and teaching myself was the objective standards for what is good. Like there are objective ways of composition, of color, of use of light that can dictate what is good. And those kinds of photos are the ones that are lasting through the years. Versus I can just throw an Instagram filter on it and everyone likes it.
Yeah, sure. How has changing technology led you to evolve in your trade, whether that is software or cameras and lenses?
That goes back even to the idea of what gear do you have. Before a 2 megapixel camera was cutting edge, and now I've got better than that in my pocket. And so technology is always going to change. And I think wanting to stay up to the latest and greatest is kind of a fool's chase, because there are some things that last, and you need to stick with what lasts if you want to stay in the business for the long haul. I will say, though, that with the increasing amount of technology that you can put in your pocket has definitely changed the game for photographers, because now everyone has a great camera in their pockets.
Yeah.
And so it begs the question, what is a professional photographer good for? And it's that we've trained our eyes to see things differently. It's that we've hopefully learned how to do it well, how to do the editing, how to do post-production, have a concept and be able to execute on the concept. For me personally, I just always have to take an evaluation of like, what is my skill set and how am I utilizing my greatest strengths outside of being able to push a button on a camera? How am I utilizing that to help my clients? Yeah.
Well, kind of going back, you said everybody's got a decent camera in their pocket now. I think there's platforms like Instagram, and in a way it seems like, especially when it first came out, it seemed like everybody thinks they're a photographer now. So
yes.
How has that changed the industry?
I wouldn't say fractured. definitely has not fractured it, but I think it's introduced a new kind of style of photography that is the Instagram photo. And I mean, even in architecture, that I've been listening to some various design podcasts, and one of them was talking about how architects are building in an Instagram wall in their public spaces. And so with photographers, you know, what you consume is what you put out. And so if all your consumption is Instagram photos and what are influencers doing, then that's what your style is going to tend towards. And so, you know, when I started out, I was just looking at a lot of National Geographic and news and journalism, photojournalism, and so that's what my style looked like. And now that I'm doing a lot more architecture, a lot of my photography is starting to change to being more straight lines, open spaces, things like that. And so, social media has opened up a very particular niche, or niche, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Of photography, and I think it's also made the consumption of photography much more broad, and so that also goes to both ways. You know, it can either make everyone feel like they can be their own photographer, and then it also kind of elevates some who are doing it really well.
Sure. I think another aspect of that is that consumers in general are more media savvy now.
Yeah.
There are a lot of influencers on some of these platforms. There's a lot more, I think just grassroots competition stemming from people trying to get off of these platforms and into the industry like you are. So in that kind of context, how do you stand apart?
I believe in the Imago Dei. Are you familiar with that term?
I'm not.
Imago Dei means that we're made in the image of God, and that each of us carries a particular piece of who God is that makes us unique, that helps us show God to other people. So we all each have a unique piece of that puzzle. And so I think nobody should be trying to be somebody else. Yeah. Meaning we should be us. You should be you, I should be me. And because of that means I have something very particularly unique about me that can bring to market. So what are those things that I'm bringing to market that are outside of just being a photographer? Mm-hmm. For me in particular, I just always noticed that I've got great relationships and that I am for you 100%, and I will do whatever I can to make it work for you. Sometimes my wife does not appreciate this as much, that she doesn't want me to be walked over. Mm-hmm. And I'm very aware of when I'm giving of myself more than is necessary, mm-hmm. but I'm still choosing to do that. And so those are that's an aspect about me, that I'm always coming to the table with, that is an intangible, mm-hmm. that I can't put numbers on, but I'm always going to bring it to any kind of prospective client, because they need to know, this is what you're getting. You're not just getting somebody that can click a button, because anyone can do that, but you're also getting somebody who's going to be for you and who's going to do whatever I can to tell your story well.
I like that perspective. Have you always had an entrepreneurial itch before you went out and started your own company, or how did that develop?
Yeah, I didn't think I did until I looked back at my life, and I remember I used to sell, you know how you can fold paper into little rings? Mm-hmm. I used to just sell that in my elementary school until my teachers caught me doing it and made me stop. And in fact, there were a couple different...
You don't have a permit for that.
Yeah. Somebody found a note I was passing to a friend of mine talking about a girl, and it was a questionnaire or something, and the principal called me and was like, "Are you selling this for a service?" I was like, "No." So I was looking back now, I'm like, oh, I guess I kind of did have that entrepreneurial spirit. And my mom definitely did. And so, yeah, I've always just wanted to kind of go my own way. And to carve my own path. I wouldn't say I've always been contrarian, but if I see something that could be better, I'd rather do it myself than listen to the tried and true path.
Sure. What are some of the challenges of managing your own business that way?
There's a perceived stability in the corporate traditional path, mm-hmm. the 401ks, retirements, the corporate ladder, the clear career path. I mean, I'm walking through that right now. We just bought a house, and the debate of...
Congratulations.
Thank you. There's a second home. So we purchased the first one, sold it, and now we're moving on to the second one. And there was just a lot of question marks about, will we be making enough money, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, those kinds of longer term questions, how am I going to be able to continue to provide for my family.
Sure.
That when there isn't a clear path forward. Now, for me, like, that's easy. I'm fine walking into the darkness and taking that next step blindly, kind of blindly. My wife isn't as comfortable with that,
Yeah.
and so it's definitely been a wrestle between us. But honestly, I mean, I look at my kids and think I wanted to give them the best, and so not having that perceived stability is difficult.
Yeah. How has that facilitated personal growth, like outside of just your work?
There's a lot of walking by faith, not by sight, and so spiritually speaking, it's really driven a confidence and a dependency on the Lord, and a gratitude. Like, every time I get a check, it's God, thank you. Like, this was a provision. And there, honestly, and I don't mean to be preachy here, this has just been my experiences. Like, there have been times when especially starting out, when I went broke, like, I had like I was in the teens in my bank account, and I remember just praying. I was like, God, like, if this is what I'm supposed to do, then I need some help, because I don't know. And then I remember very distinctly, as I said amen, the phone would ring, or I would get notified, oh, sorry, your check got lost, here it is. Like, just randomly, money would just show up. And there was this awe that came of that, and going, hey, like, there's provision. And so just on the personal side, outside of photography, like, that's really, really grown my faith.
Awesome. So you're not part of an agency. You have worked alongside people that are parts of agencies before. How is it different creatively than what you do?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the agency. So I've worked with anyone from, small little boutique agencies to, the Richards Group, which is large, national agency. The larger they are, the less creative freedom you have. The smaller they are, the more they trust you. And it's really fun. I like working with the smaller groups where I get a little bit more input. With some of the larger organizations, that's just a lot of demand. Like, hi, I need this right now. And then you turn over this proposal to them within 24 hours, and then you wait for 2 weeks and then find out later that it got canceled. Like, great, thanks for the hurry up and wait. And then nothing.
Interesting. How do you stay productive? Is that ever a challenge for you, running your own show?
It can be, for sure. That's part of where that structured organizational part of my brain really helps. If I can create structures for myself, then that gives me the framework that I can operate in. And honestly, sometimes you just need a break. And so just to embrace the lulls and recognize that you're not being as productive. I think we have a really high value on productivity in the Western culture.
Sure.
And I think it's a little bit to our detriment. So I'm really trying to find what's the right balance there.
How do you stay up to date with how things are changing within your industry, and how do you continue learning?
A lot of it has to do with my client work. So some clients just request something that's a little bit more trendy, which I am not very much of a trendy person. But, I'm always just reading, seeing what is the latest and greatest, what's out there. I'm not a tech head necessarily, even though I can be. So I don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of the newest cameras. But I'm trying to listen to my clients to figure out what are their needs. When 4K is big right now and everyone's trying to move to filming in 4K, most of my clients don't need 4K. And so I can film in 4K, but it's not necessarily something that I'm drooling over to get the next big camera that does amazing 4K, because it's just really not part of my demand right now.
Interesting. What's the biggest challenge of working with clients when they have a creative idea in mind and balancing that with your experience and expertise and your creative vision?
Sure. I think educating the client is always going to be one of the biggest parts of being a professional. I think a lot of clients have great visions and great ideas, and sometimes their budgets don't necessarily meet their appetites.
Yeah.
I think some people have creative ideas, but they're stuck 10 years old. And so you're trying to tell them, hey, like, if we do it like that, it will date you. And it'll put you in this little box
Sure.
that everyone has already walked past. And so it's just trying to help them understand some of those things. And then obviously educating people on what things cost. I'm working with a client right now who we started off with a budget, and then they added more things. I said, okay, this is what it's going to cost to get those extra things. And, they're kind of getting a little blown away and just trying to help them understand what things are. And at the same time going, I recognize fiscally you have budgets. That's okay. Like, what can we do to work within those constraints? And as a photographer, like, it's good to work within constraints. And as an entrepreneur, it's good to work because everyone has them, and you need to be creative in how do you operate within those boundaries.
Do you think that those boundaries push you to be more creative sometimes?
Absolutely. I was trying to think of one of those old adages, and I'm just blanking on it. But yes, like when you don't have all the means to have everything that you want, you have to learn to improvise and to be flexible.
Yeah, sure. You talked earlier about how much relationships with your clients matter to you. Do you think your talent for building relationships allows you to execute the education and making people realize, why this needs to be this way, why this costs this much? Does that help you in that regard?
It should. I think there's that people pleaser side of me that doesn't want to, or that gets nervous about doing those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I try it as best as I can, as much as I can. Thankfully, a lot of my clients are generally understanding, so I'm having to do less education for them. I could probably be a much better educator as far as that goes on initial contact with any new clients.
You mentioned earlier being passionate about storytelling and that being a driving factor in what you do. And so, storytelling from like a verbal tradition historically is a long format art. So how do you condense that kind of philosophy into a video clip or just even into a single image?
Sure. Well, I think, yes, I do believe storytelling is a longer form. And so I think when you try to assign one image as a story, that doesn't make sense. And I think that's a pretty common thing within photography of going, oh, you're such a great storyteller. I saw that photo. And it's like that. No, you just captured a moment, and I could tell you any story about that. I've actually got into some arguments with friends of mine who are like, hate that. It almost looks like poverty porn. Like where it's just like that poor African child. Mm-hmm. But I know the story behind that photo, and if I share that story, it's nowhere close to being poverty porn. Yeah. It's actually a story of hope, but it's just one image, so you don't really know the context. And so I do believe that when it comes to storytelling, you need to figure out what the story is first, and then you figure out what's the means by which you tell that story. And so that's where I push a lot of my clients when they're like, oh, we need this kind of photo. Well, why do you need that photo? Because this is what we're trying to tell. Well, if you're trying to tell that story, here's a better way to tell that story. And it may or may not even include video. Mm-hmm. It could be just only graphical, or it could be a podcast, or it could be just a new website, things like that. And so that's where I think we could all benefit with the idea of storytelling.
Awesome. So you talked about how you've transitioned into commercial jobs. You've mentioned working with architects. Mm-hmm. Specifically, what sort of projects are you doing right now?
Yeah, so working with a few different folks within the realm of commercial spaces, so and industrial spaces, so big warehouses, trying to work with builders and developers and property managers on getting their spaces leased out or sold wholesale, or a lot of in the commercial office space, just capturing for real estate, for leasing, as well as for development, showing befores and afters of creating an entire district. So it's been fun to have a fairly wide breadth of styles and building types and processes, being in the process.
Nice. So whether it's within that context or outside of it, what are some specific projects you've enjoyed working on the most? One I'd be interested in hearing about is you did work on a documentary in which you had the opportunity to film the band Korn. Yep. So can you talk about that and maybe any other standout projects?
Yeah. So the Korn thing was fun. That came out of working out of that creative co-working space called Weld. A guy named Trey Hill was the director for the project, and he was telling the story about Brian Head Welch and kind of his journey through life and leaving the band and then coming back to it. And it was ended up being more about his relationship with his daughter. It's called Loud Crazy Love. And when Head had joined back up with the band, they were kind of doing a reunion tour, and they were coming through Dallas on Halloween. And so it was just nuts.
It's fitting.
Yes. I mean, it was amazing. And I got to run camera a little bit, like one of the B cams or one of this kind of the supplemental footage, and got to run audio boom for some interviews, got to be a PA. I mean, kind of all hands on deck for that one. But it was just a lot of fun. He just tapped into his network, for other creatives that could help out, and we all got to play a little piece of it. So it was a lot of fun to work on that, and get to meet Head as part of his reunion, and just the highs of that show, which was amazing.
Were you familiar with them much?
I mean, I knew their music. I wasn't necessarily a metalhead at all. There were the opening bands I didn't know at all, but then actually getting to be behind the stage and right behind the drum kit and off to the side, watching them perform definitely made me want to see more Korn shows after that.
Cool.
But it also, I mean, I love any of those behind the scenes stuff where you get to see behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
It just makes things so much more interesting to me.
Very cool. What are some other standout projects?
Getting to do more image library stuff. So I think there's a move right now away from stock, and stock imagery is, you go to Getty Images or Adobe Stock and you just buy an image, or sometimes it's even free. And you get to use that on your website wherever you want. But it's the same image that everybody else is using. And so now companies are starting to want to have their own images, their own library of images that are more tailored to them. So that one's moving into that space has been a lot of fun, because everything's different and it's always a different style, but you get to help with that client's story, and then you get to create an image library for them that is more specific to them. So I've gotten to work with some hospital systems, helping out build the imagery for their unique or individual clinics, getting to help do some for small businesses, that's a lot of fun, because small businesses definitely have a lot more personality, and so you get to kind of showcase that.
Yeah,
and it's always fun to do that.
You've done some humanitarian work in the past. I think the rewarding aspect of that is fairly self-explanatory. What's the most rewarding aspect of the work you're currently doing?
I think the most rewarding is getting to see it out in the open. Nonprofit world, there's a smaller sector of people I think that see it, because there's just not as much of an audience necessarily. But when you're doing more commercial work, that's going out to people of all stripes and colors, and so it's fun every time I get a little message that says, "Hey, check it out," and I get to see a little brochure or get to see Instagram posts and things like that, kind of marketing my work. And it's fun.
Yeah. What is something you would change about your industry?
I don't even know where to start with that one. I think there's a lot of different places that I'd like to see changed as far as what is the standard for success. It's not the amount of followers that you have. I think that's a really easy temptation. The necessity to have all the right gear. And I think the biggest thing is really just the ethics behind photography.
What do you mean by that?
Using a photo of someone to get a Pulitzer Prize or to get more fame and notoriety, and you're not necessarily even showing the real story behind what's actually happening, but you just saw, this is a good photo. I bet you I can submit this to a bunch of magazines and get a lot of money for it. I think there's that drive just to get that right photo without realizing or understanding the story behind that photo. Yeah,
can be exploitative. Yeah. That makes sense. So we are in 2020. Obviously, the big story of the year is the COVID-19 pandemic. How have the events of this year and COVID caused you to pivot in your business, and how has that led to growth for you personally or professionally?
So, I read a blog at the beginning of the year when COVID first hit that said this is the blizzard at the beginning of a 2-year winter with no summers. And I thought, well, that sucks. And it's really held true. Like I had my entire year's worth of work wiped clean.
Wow.
Starting in March. And so when you have 6 months worth of income wiped off, it makes you reconsider what you're doing. So I definitely looked around to see, is there another industry or another place where I could provide income for my family? And there probably were, but then business started coming back up in a different way. The purpose of that blog was just to say that the game has fundamentally changed for everyone. Unless you're a Google or an Amazon, you have to do business differently. Why you do business is the same. Sure. Who you're working for, that's the same. But how you do it needs to change. And so I've had to pivot a lot. You know, I know I've relied a lot on my cost of doing business to figure out how am I going to price projects. Mm-hmm. And what I used to price projects for, I'm not pricing the same way now. And especially at the beginning of the pandemic, anytime a client would ask, like, hey, what are your rates? I said, I know that your business is hurting, so I'm going to be flexible to whatever we can make work for both of us. And I knew what my bottom line was of what I needed to be bringing in, which changed because my budgets changed personally and professionally. It definitely got to dip down. And so I've had to really be much more flexible. And for a while, I swore off doing video just because I wanted to focus 100% on photography, and everything has gone online, including, Zoom calls and everything. And so a lot of my work has actually been editing videos that other people have shot that they needed to look a little bit more professional. So they send it over to me. And oddly enough, I've actually enjoyed it way more than I thought I would. Or than I did. Yeah. I used to hate it.
Is it challenging working within the context of what somebody else has created and, navigating, adding your value to that while maintaining, what they've done?
Sure. Yeah. The temptation is there to say, oh, that looks like crap. I don't want my name on that.
People love hearing that.
Yes. I think there's a false sense of ego in the creative sphere that everything I put out has to be amazing and has to look like me. When that's not necessarily the case. What I'm delivering to my clients needs to look like them. Yeah. And so I need to go by, am I doing better than what their standards are? As long as I'm able to deliver that, then I'm still doing okay. And sometimes it really doesn't look great. Like I've taken iPhone videos that people have sent me and said, hey, can you just clean this up? I'm like, I'm not sure where to start, but sure. And then obviously that's where some of the education comes in. It's like, hey, it's not going to sound like this or it's not going to look like this. As long as we understand what expectations are, then we're doing okay. And I think that's where a lot of it comes. I think COVID has changed the expectation of what things should look like, both in providing higher quality as well as providing lower standards. Like a Zoom call isn't going to look amazing, but everyone expects it to be a Zoom call. So they're not expecting it to be the latest, Hollywood film.
Sure. What about on the higher quality end of that you just mentioned?
So they're wanting, it's more of where most people are expecting an iPhone video. Let me provide you with something that's a higher quality. I just helped the Dallas Opera with a rebroadcast of Carmen, and it was shot 2 years ago, so technology is a little bit different, and some of the styling is a little bit different, but I was able to provide them with something that was a better quality than their original film to match up with theirs. And so it helps make them look good and clean and professional.
Yeah, very cool. Where do you see the future of the photography, videography, marketing industries going right now in light of COVID and just in light of, where it would be going naturally?
Yeah, I think, like I talked about before, I see more need for custom image libraries, custom imagery that's more tailored to the to your client. I see a big draw as far as storytelling goes. There's tons of stuff that's getting put out right now that I've just been paying attention more about what is storytelling and how do you do good storytelling and how do you keep it clean and get to this point. I think a lot of people are really needing to have a story that they are part of that is inspiring and inviting people to take a part in that.
Yeah. What are some of your professional goals moving forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd love to keep growing my business back to what it was pre-COVID. That's a big goal.
Sure.
But there are a couple different arenas, new spaces that I'm kind of moving into or considering. One of them is, I mentioned before, like how much I operate more on the business technical side of things, like spreadsheets. Love helping people figure out what their cost of doing business is, how to set up a business, like being more on the business end to think through some of those things and coaching people through those. So I've got a few clients, friends and otherwise who I'm helping them kind of think through what's their story and how to structure it so that they can continue to do this as a career, not just as a hobby.
Yeah.
And then also working with a few different folks on helping tell their story, again, with those custom image libraries. But not even just that, it's also like helping them develop a website and trying to help them tell their story better on an online presence. And really working through what is this story, who's your client, who's the hero of your story, and really getting to capture that really well.
Awesome. Well, that's our time for today. Where can our listeners learn more about you and your business? Any social media, websites, anything you want to shout out?
Yep. My website's www.paulgoimages.com, and that's pretty much my presence all online. So Paul Go Images.
PaulGoImages.com. Awesome. Well, Paul, thank you for your time today. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise, Tim. Appreciate you.
Thank you, everybody listening. This has been KLLR Creatives. Peace.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to KLLR Creatives.